You won't believe me, but here it goes. I wish I had never moved into that apartment. I'll never forget the first time I saw the place. It was a typical Thursday afternoon in early autumn when I walked into the building, looking for something affordable in the city. I was a college grad, struggling with the high rents in Chicago, and after months of searching, I thought I had found a decent spot, cheap but clean. Or at least that's what the ad had promised. The agent, a young woman named Kelly, greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but I was too eager to care. The moment I stepped into apartment 2B, a strange chill crept over me. The place was oddly quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. I shrugged it off as the usual old building atmosphere, and Kelly quickly showed me the basics: stove, fridge, basic furniture. There was one thing, though, that didn't sit right with me. The hallway. It was narrow and suffocating, with faded wallpaper peeling along the edges. As we passed the door to the other apartment on that floor, I heard the faintest sound, a muffled thump, almost like something heavy falling. Kelly didn't seem to notice, but I caught a flash of unease in her eyes before she quickly changed the subject. It's a sound I would come to recognize all too well in the coming weeks. But back then, I was too distracted by the price tag. This place was affordable. I signed the lease that day, and 2 days later I was moving in. The first night was uneventful, at least on the surface. But I kept hearing things. Footsteps, whispers that seemed to echo from the walls. I chalked it up to the creaky old building settling, and told myself that I was just imagining things. But the whispers got louder, distinct. I should have listened to that nagging feeling deep in my gut. At first, I tried to ignore it. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but it got to a point where I couldn't avoid the truth. The first week was an odd mix of normal and strange. During the day, everything seemed fine. I went to work, ran errands, and came home to what seemed like an empty apartment. But when night fell, it all changed. The whispers began again, louder now. It wasn't like the sound of voices you could identify, no. It was more like the faint murmur of distant conversations, too muffled to understand, but unmistakably there. The worst part? It always came from the walls. I would sit on the couch watching TV, and there it was, whispers like someone was standing right next to me, talking just out of earshot. I even tried to place my ear against the walls, but the noise always seemed to come from deeper within the apartment. It wasn't the neighbors because the walls were thick, and I never saw anyone else around. One evening, after a particularly loud string of whispers, I decided to investigate. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and began to carefully examine the corners of the apartment. The living room, the kitchen, the bathroom all seemed empty, just as they always were. But then, when I approached the back bedroom, I froze. The door to the closet was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see the faintest sliver of darkness. I wasn't sure why, but something about that dark space sent a cold shiver down my spine. I had never opened it since moving in. Something about it felt wrong. I pushed the door open slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The closet was small, barely enough room for a few jackets and shoes. But in the back corner, behind an old wooden shelf, there was something strange. A large, dark stain on the wall. It was subtle, hidden by the shelf, but when the light hit it at the right angle, it was unmistakable. A stain, old and discolored, like something had been smeared across the plaster. I don't know why, but I felt the urge to touch it. As soon as my fingers brushed against the wall, a cold wave of energy washed over me, unnatural, suffocating. And then I heard it, a voice, clearer than ever before, right behind me. "Get out." I spun around, but there was no one. My breath caught in my throat as the room seemed to pulse, the air thickening around me. I didn't need to see more. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my heart racing. The whispers didn't stop that night. They only grew louder. I didn't sleep, couldn't. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but after that night, I couldn't deny it anymore. Something was in that apartment with me. The next few days felt like I was walking through a fog. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified. I could barely focus on work, couldn't look at the walls without thinking of that stain in the closet. The whispers grew more distinct, and I was losing my grip on what was real. I decided to reach out to Kelly, the building agent. I sent her a message, telling her about the strange noises and the odd feeling I was getting in the apartment. She didn't respond immediately. When she finally did, her answer was unsettling. "I thought you knew about the history. You should have asked about the place before signing the lease. It's not exactly a typical apartment." Her message left me with more questions than answers. What did she mean? What was wrong with this place? I called her, and when she picked up, her voice sounded tight. "You don't want to know what happened here," she said, almost whispering. "But you need to get out. It's been happening to people for years. Just leave while you can. You're not the first to experience things. People who stay get affected. You'll never feel safe again. Not until you go." I didn't get a chance to ask her what she meant. She hung up before I could say anything. I called her again, but this time the line was dead. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the thump, a heavy sound, like something hitting the floor, but this time it came from the ceiling. I looked up, half expecting to see the faint outline of something moving overhead. But there was nothing. The apartment was silent, except for the whispers. They were coming from everywhere now, around me, inside me. I had to know what was going on. I couldn't stay in the dark any longer. The next morning, I went to the building's office, desperate to find answers. The man at the desk, someone I hadn't seen before, looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "You're the new tenant in 2B?" he asked, his voice strange. I nodded. "Don't let the building get to you," he warned, leaning in. "It's been like this for decades. People come and go, but the apartment never forgets. You can't escape it, but you can leave if you're willing." That's when I started to put it together. The building had a dark history, one that no one talked about. I'd heard rumors from people who worked there. There had been accidents, suicides. At least 3 previous tenants had disappeared without a trace. But it was what the man said next that froze me in place. 2B was the worst of them. Don't say I didn't warn you. I was getting closer to the truth, but every step forward felt like I was sinking deeper into something I couldn't control. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, too terrified to close my eyes, knowing that the apartment wasn't just old. It was alive, in a way. I could feel it, creeping and watching. The whispers were deafening now. They came from every corner, from the walls, the ceiling, and even under the floorboards. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to find out what was really going on. I decided to return to the building's office the next day, hoping to speak with the man who had warned me. But when I arrived, the office was locked. I pounded on the door, but no one answered. That's when I noticed something strange. A worn-out old bulletin board by the entrance. It had yellowing notices, flyers about repairs, and then a small, folded piece of paper pinned to the corner. I grabbed it, my hands trembling as I unfolded it. It was an old, faded newspaper article, dated nearly 30 years ago. The headline read, "Tragic Accident Claims Life of Young Woman in Building Collapse." The article went on to describe a horrific accident in the very apartment building I was living in. Apparently, a woman named Laura Peters had been living in 2B when a mysterious incident occurred. The building's management had claimed it was an accidental collapse, but neighbors spoke of something much darker. People said that Laura had been involved in strange rituals, always talking to herself, always looking over her shoulder like someone was following her. Her final days were filled with madness, and according to the article, she had been found dead in the very closet of 2B, the same closet where I had felt that strange presence. The article ended with a chilling note. Her cause of death remains unknown, but neighbors report hearing unsettling sounds in the building long after the tragedy. My stomach dropped as I processed what I had read. Laura had died in the apartment, and now those same whispers, the ones I had been hearing, were the voices of those who had come before me. I was living in the same place where she had died. I rushed back to the apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out. I had to leave before it was too late. But as soon as I stepped into the hallway, the lights flickered, the temperature dropped, and then I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the end of the hallway stood a shadow, tall and thin, barely visible in the dark. But I could feel its presence. It was waiting for me. The whispers began again, louder than ever. But this time they weren't just whispers. They were words, clear, cold words. "You're next." I froze. The shadow moved, gliding toward me, its footsteps soundless. Couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The hallway was empty again. The only sound, the beating of my own heart. I had to leave. I had no choice. I thought I could escape it, but I was wrong. That apartment had already claimed me. It knew I was there. I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. The fear, the pressure, it was all consuming. I rushed back to my place, grabbing what I could, ready to leave. But as I stepped through the door of 2B, something felt different. The air was thicker. The darkness in the room felt more oppressive, like it was pulling at me, suffocating me. And then the whispers came again. But this time, they weren't just disembodied voices. They were close. The sound of breath, cold, labored, almost human. The presence in the room was undeniable. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. There, in the corner of the living room, stood a figure. A woman. Her face was pale, gaunt, almost skeletal. Her eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto mine with an intensity that sent a shock through my body. She didn't speak, but I heard her thoughts, loud and clear. "Why do you stay?" I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room, and I was drowning in silence. Her eyes pierced into me, reading every thought, every fear I had ever buried deep inside. She stepped forward, her presence overwhelming. The smell of decay filled the air, and I could feel something cold and clammy brushing against my skin. I stumbled back, tripping over the furniture, but the figure followed. The walls around me began to close in, their distorted shapes warping like they were alive. The apartment was shifting, twisting, changing, becoming a nightmare. The whispers were louder now, coming from every direction. The voices were no longer just random murmurs, but a cacophony of words, demands, all of them coming from the woman. She wanted me to stay. She wanted me to join her. The more I tried to back away, the tighter the apartment's grip became. The floor beneath me felt like it was sinking into a void, the walls pressing in from all sides. I could feel her growing stronger, her cold fingers reaching for me, wrapping around my throat like a vice. In that moment, I realized the truth. I wasn't just a tenant in an old building. I was trapped in a cycle, part of the apartment's curse, just like every other soul who had walked through that door. I had one choice: leave. I ran for the door, heart racing, terror gripping my every muscle. But as I reached for the handle, I heard her voice, clearer than ever, sharp as a knife. "You can't leave. You never will." I pulled on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The apartment had claimed me. I turned back, and in the corner of the room, the woman was standing, waiting, watching. There was no escaping now. I fought for my life, but there are some things you can't escape. The apartment had me, and I couldn't let it take me without a fight. The door wouldn't open. No matter how hard I yanked on the handle, no matter how violently I pulled, it stayed locked. The shadows in the room shifted around me, suffocating every last breath. The whispers grew more frantic, and the woman's presence loomed larger, her cold eyes following my every movement. I knew then that I had one final chance. Confront it. Confront her. I turned back toward the figure, my hands shaking, my breath shallow. My mind raced through all the things I had learned, about the history of this place, about Laura Peters, and about the curse that held it all together. I wasn't the first. I wouldn't be the last. But what if I could break it? What if I could do what others before me couldn't? There had to be a way out. "Laura!" I shouted, though my voice felt weak and small. "I know what happened to you. I know what you've been through. You don't have to keep hurting people. Let me go." For a moment, the room went still. The whispers ceased, and the woman's dark eyes narrowed at me, as if assessing my words. I could feel the weight of her stare, like she was looking into my very soul. She didn't speak, but her presence seemed to grow darker, colder. Then, with a swift motion, she reached toward me. I backed away, desperate. I had to do something, anything to stop her from getting closer. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, an old lamp, and swung it at her. It passed right through her, as if she was made of smoke. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest, as the room seemed to warp around me. The walls were twisting, contorting into shapes that didn't belong. The air was thick with a terrible, suffocating pressure. It was like the apartment itself was alive, breathing, watching, waiting for me to give in. I wouldn't. In a burst of desperation, I ran to the back of the apartment, toward the closet. I remembered the stain on the wall, the stain that had never left. It had been the key all along. I had to destroy it. If I could destroy the source, maybe I could destroy the curse. I pulled at the shelf, tearing it from the wall. My hands bled as I scraped against the old wood. But I didn't care. I had to get to the stain. I had to erase it. And there, behind the shelf, was the secret. A small, cracked mirror, lying face down against the wall. I didn't know why, but I knew that this was it. This was the object that bound everything together. I picked it up, my fingers trembling as I turned it over. The glass was cold to the touch, the reflection in it distorted, like looking into a funhouse mirror. And in that moment, I saw something I couldn't explain. A flash of the woman's face, Laura's face, but now it was twisted, deformed. Her lips curled into a malicious smile. I felt it, the curse, the weight of it pressing down on me. But I had no choice. I smashed the mirror against the floor with every ounce of strength I had left. When I broke the mirror, I thought I was freeing myself. But I soon realized that what I'd unleashed was far worse than anything I could have imagined. The instant the mirror shattered, an ear-piercing screech filled the apartment. Louder than any whisper, more shrill than any voice. It echoed through every inch of the building, rattling the very foundations. The air grew thick, as if the very atmosphere was suffocating me, and the temperature plummeted. My breath came out in frosty clouds, and I felt an intense pressure on my chest, like something was trying to crush me from all sides. The figure of Laura, or whatever she had become, flickered violently in front of me. Her face twisted in agony, her features warping with every passing second, her screams merging with the other voices that had plagued me. The whispers were now shrieks, incomprehensible and deafening. I could feel the apartment itself reaching for me, its walls closing in, its floor buckling. The air was thick with anger, a violent energy that I could feel in my very bones. It was as if the entire building had been awakened, and raged that I had disturbed it. The woman, Laura, was no longer just a ghost. She was something else now, something more powerful. I turned and ran, my legs barely able to keep up with the pounding in my chest. The hallway stretched out before me, but it was no longer familiar. The walls seemed to twist, the doorways crooked, as though the building was changing, shifting with each step I took. It was like running through a maze that was alive, constantly rearranging itself to trap me. I reached the stairs. As I ran down the steps, the lights above flickered out one by one. The darkness grew, swallowing everything around me. I could hear her footsteps now, soft, like bare feet padding against the floor, coming from behind. Her presence was closing in, just inches from me. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The front door was in sight. I was almost there, just a few more steps. But as my hand reached for the handle, I felt a cold, clammy grip on my shoulder. I whipped around, but nothing was there. And yet I could feel her, right there, her cold breath on my neck, her whisper in my ear, "You can't leave." I pulled open the door and ran into the night air, gasping for breath. The street was silent, the city lights casting a dull glow on the sidewalk. I was outside. I was free. But as I stumbled down the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me, watching, waiting. That apartment had claimed so many lives before me, and no matter how far I ran, it would never let me go. I had escaped the building, but I hadn't escaped its curse. And the worst part? I knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before it came looking for me again. Leaving didn't set me free. Followed me. It always followed me. I tried to forget. I tried to move on, to believe that I had escaped, that the nightmare was over. But there's something you don't understand until you've experienced it firsthand. Some things don't just stay behind when you leave them. They follow you. They cling to you, like a shadow, waiting for the moment when you let your guard down. First, everything seemed normal. I moved into a new apartment, a few miles away from the cursed building. It was different, clean, bright. A far cry from the suffocating presence of 2B. I convinced myself that I was free, but there was something off, a strange feeling that I couldn't shake. Every time I was alone, especially at night, I felt like I was being watched. I would hear whispers, faint, distant, just out of reach. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, the lingering effects of the trauma. But the whispers began to grow louder. They followed me from room to room, like they were always just behind me. It wasn't just the walls anymore. It was everywhere. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the stress, the fear. But then, one night, I woke up to find something I couldn't explain. The walls were wet. It was a cold, damp feeling, like the entire apartment was sweating. The floor was slick under my feet, and when I touched the walls, they were clammy, cold to the touch. I flipped on the lights, but nothing changed. The room was still dim, the air heavy with something unspoken. I could hear it, those whispers again, this time louder than ever. They were coming from the walls, but they weren't the same as before. These weren't the voices of the dead. These were mine, my own thoughts distorted, like they were being twisted by someone else. I backed away, my heart pounding, my breath shallow. Then I saw it. In the corner of the room, just above the molding, the walls began to move. Not in the way they did when a building settles, but in a more unnatural way. As if something inside the walls was pushing against them, trying to break free. I froze. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. It was coming for me. The apartment. The curse. It was never gone. It had followed me. It always had. I thought I could outrun it, that I could hide. But in the end, you can't escape what was never meant to let you go. Couldn't breathe. The whispers in the walls grew louder, swirling around me like an angry wind. They were mine, but they didn't feel like mine. It was like something inside me was being dragged out, twisted, and contorted. My own voice turned against me. I backed away, but the walls were closing in. The floor, the ceiling, everything felt like it was shifting, bending, warping. The space around me grew smaller, tighter, like the apartment was squeezing the life out of me. And then I saw it. A face half-formed in the wall. Pale, distorted. Its eyes wide and empty, staring right at me. Couldn't look away. I didn't want to look away. It was as if the face was pulling me in, drawing me closer to something I didn't understand. My pulse raced as I turned toward the door, desperate to leave. I yanked on the handle. It was locked. Panic set in. The apartment, no, the curse, had me once again. It was pulling me in, slowly but surely, into its grasp. I scrambled to the windows, pulling at the blinds, trying to get out, to escape, but I saw only blackness outside. It was as if the world had vanished. There was no street, no sky, just a thick, suffocating void that pressed against the glass, mocking me. The whispers were louder now, surrounding me, crawling under my skin, and I heard them clearly. "You're never leaving." I stumbled back, my body shaking, the walls closing in, the air so thick I could barely breathe. The lights flickered and then went out completely. The apartment was pitch black, and in the dark, I felt something cold brush past me, something cold and alive. I turned, and there it was, the figure. It was Laura, but she wasn't just standing there. She was moving, gliding toward me, her face a twisted mockery of the woman I had seen before. Her limbs were too long, her body contorted, stretching unnaturally. The darkness seemed to come from her, swallowing everything in her wake. "You can never escape me," she whispered, her voice distant, like it was coming from all directions at once. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to run, unable to scream. Then the walls cracked open. Not the plaster, but something deeper, something ancient. The apartment itself was breaking apart, revealing something. A black void, swirling with movement, with shadows and whispers. It was as if the building had been a prison for something far darker than I could comprehend. Something that had fed on the fear, the death, and the souls of those who had lived there before. I could feel it reaching for me. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized there was no escaping this. I tried one last time. I reached for the door, yanking with everything I had. It wouldn't budge. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper. And I knew, with a sinking certainty, that the curse was not just in the apartment. It was in me. It had been with me all along. Laura's face loomed over me, her eyes cold and empty, her lips curling into a final, horrifying grin. "You're mine now." And then, there was nothing. I thought I was just running from an apartment, from a curse. But now I know the truth. The building never let me go. It was never about the place. It was about me. When I woke up, I wasn't sure if I was alive. The apartment was gone. But I wasn't outside either. I was in a room. A dark, cold room that felt like it had no beginning and no end. The walls were the same as before, peeling and warped, but this time they were alive. They shifted, breathing, pulsating as if they were watching me. I could hear whispers, but not just whispers anymore. They were voices, dozens, hundreds of them, speaking over each other, their words unintelligible. Screams, pleads for mercy, cries of despair. But they weren't just coming from the walls. They were coming from me. I stood up, dizzy, my legs unsteady as if I hadn't moved in years. The room seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions, like the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. Then I saw her, Laura, but she was different. Her body was no longer twisted or contorted. She was standing still now, her face the same as when I first saw her, but with a hollow sadness in her eyes. The kind of sadness that speaks of a tortured existence. Her lips parted, but instead of a scream, she whispered softly, "You never understood." I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at her as if I was seeing a ghost from the past. But she wasn't just a ghost. She was a part of this place, this cursed thing that had claimed all of us. Every soul who had ever stepped into that apartment. She stepped forward, her gaze never leaving mine. This is what it's like. I felt a jolt in my chest, a horrible realization. It wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about the building. It was the cycle. We were all trapped in it. Trapped in the walls, trapped in the curse. All the voices, all the shadows. It was a web, an endless nightmare that ensnared anyone who dared enter. We were all deceived. She whispered, "You thought you could run. But the curse isn't about a building. It's about the souls it consumes. You, me, everyone. We're all part of it now." And then she reached out. Her hand brushed mine, cold as ice. And in that instant, everything shattered. The walls dissolved into darkness. The whispers faded into oblivion. But I didn't feel relief. I felt something worse. The cold embrace of nothingness, a crushing absence. The building was gone, but I wasn't free. I was part of it now, just another voice in the wall. The cycle was complete.